Okay, everybody, thank you for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John Andrews, but as always, you can just call me PJ. So today with me, I have Cairo Smith, who is a filmmaker, a writer, a podcaster, triple threat. So Cairo, I want to say thanks for coming so much. Thanks for coming on the show. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and the work that you do, and we'll jump into it?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely, PJ. Thanks for having me. I feel like we've tried a couple times to get this on the books, and we're just such busy, popular guys that
We are.
we kept missing each other in the night. Now it feels like third time's a charm. So thanks for having me on. I'm glad we were able to make it work. Yeah, you covered it pretty well. My name is Cairo Smith. I'm based in LA. I'm a writer. I'm the editor-in-chief of Futurist Letters, which is a Substack-based literary journal for essays and fiction, both of which we pay a little bit for, and you can find things running roughly weekly there. That's also where I run my show, the Futurist Letters Show, where we bring on interesting literary, tech, cultural guests. And other than that, I am by training a screenwriter. I've written on a lot of different shows in varying capacities, worked in a lot of writers' rooms in TV. I also am a novelist and I write short stories. You can go to cairosmith.com and find all the relevant links for all my work. And I just basically try to stay busy doing whatever it is that interests me. I sort of let the passion be the guide.
Well, that's a great policy. So I reread, because like you said, we were trying to do this for, God, it feels like at least a good 6 weeks or more now, and it's just not quite happened. And I originally read a couple of those pieces that you sent me, but I reread Locked In today, and that one was like, I feel like particularly visceral. And we can kind of maybe talk about that a little bit if you want. But first, it's maybe the cliche question, but I'm always interested in, what made you want to be a writer? Like, what are some of those early influences, or maybe that, proverbial, you're under the covers with the flashlight reading? What first really inspired that love of literature and stories for you?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure if it's not genetic or something that happened to me in the womb, then it happened at a very, very early age, because I remember writing stories and specifically typing stories basically as soon as I got a keyboard in front of me and was somewhat literate. I was attempting novels from the age of, I think, 5 or 6, not with a whole lot of success, but putting in the early work. And there's never been a time that I haven't been writing fiction for my own pleasure, whether that be, sort of a fan fiction era, or collaborating with other people on their stories, writing screenplays, or working on novels. I can't remember really a me that hasn't been doing this. So I like to say that even if I knew I would never make a dime and nobody, outside my immediate family would ever read anything I wrote, I would probably still keep writing the rest of my life. It's just something I feel like I have to do, and more than that, to do the best I can, and try and grow at it.
Well, I think you have an excellent voice from what I've read so far, and I would definitely I would like to read more. I remember because I mean it's one of those things where, like, believe it or not, I'm kind of new to the social media world. Substack was my first social media. I mean, I had Facebook, or MySpace, like everybody did back in the day, but around 2016 I deleted my Facebook. For some reason there was a lot of toxicity in the year of 2016. You could say why.
I wonder what could have been happening.
That's for the historians to figure out. But all that to say, like, you were one of those people who I just saw on the timeline. And Substack, now you post a clever or funny thing here or there. That's, I think, how a lot of us will encounter people initially. Then I think the first time I really listened to you in depth was when you went on Pedro Gonzalez's podcast, and Pedro has done this podcast before, so shout out to him. But it was a really interesting conversation that you guys had, like, about publishing and writing and working in screenplays and stuff. And I kind of wanted to dig into that a little bit, because I've talked to a number of different people on my podcast who are authors, either published or self-published. My best friend is a published author in the self-publishing world. My wife is a writer, and she's working on getting something self-published. And it seems to be between books and movies, TV, it seems like everything is just in such a moment of flux. Just as the traditional studios seem to be losing sway, or traditional publishers, much in the same way. Like I did a little research the other day that the sales are still very high, but the way that publishing will actually there's not a terrible amount of transparency of what is actually selling, whether or not it's old things versus new things. So I guess it's maybe one of the signatures of my show. I ask very long-winded questions, but my long-winded way of asking what it's like working in that, being actual, that's how you make your bread, working writer in this moment where there seems to be so much volatility in the industry.
Yeah, I can't really speak to traditional publishing, to be clear, because that has been a fortress that I have, outside of comic books and graphic novels, completely failed to penetrate in any form. I mean, I've done my share of querying over the years. I've done my share of chats with literary agents back and forth about the publishing world, and I've never had a project for this or that reason that enticed an agent to the point where they would want to take me on specifically for literary in the novels space. It's funny. I actually feel like as I've sort of moved out of my juvenilia, obviously when you're a teenager, there's going to be a little bit of a YA flavor to whatever you write. And I was actually getting the most traction with traditional publishing at that time, in my late teens. So 10 years ago. Admittedly, the industry was also less extinct at that point. So maybe I just showed up for the end of it. But I can't exactly speak to that beyond the sense that I think as I've matured and gotten better as a writer, my work has also been less to the taste of those gatekeepers. However, yeah, I can speak to graphic novels and also to Hollywood, and it is very much a relationship industry. And obviously there's a little bit of that you could say, oh, it's self-serving. Oh, people just want to help their friends. But there are other practical reasons why it's so insular in this way, and that's because it's very hard to assess the quality of a writer. You really need to invest a lot in reading their work and figuring out if you think they're any good, unless there's some metric like sales or like winning the Booker, and even then there's still contention. There are people who win major literary awards that other people are convinced are garbage. So that's really the reason why when you're a producer and you need something written and you don't need it to be the most experimental and avant-garde literary work ever, you just need it to be solid, you're gonna keep going back to the same people because you've invested so much effort in vetting them. And for that reason, you make someone happy, you get repeat work. That's basically how it goes. And none of that really happens in a publicly visible way. None of that happens online. None of that is really happening in comment sections. And even in the spheres that I'm not invited to, like mid or high budget film, I have friends who work in those circles, and I watch them, and it's the same thing. It's all relationships.
And do you think it's either you're in the club or you're outside of the club, or is it more of can you be a journeyman type writer and you could see yourself working your way up, or what does that typically look like?
So there's very much the same thing happening in writing that is happening in every facet of American society where power is consolidated, which is basically where there are more and more waves of young and middle-aged talented people coming in, and the senior talent aren't leaving and the pie isn't growing, and so you get a big squeeze. I mean, you can see this with politics. You can see this with the ownership of capital, home ownership. This is something that's broadly recurs across American society, and it's definitely true in writing as well. I like to joke that, the reason that Lucas, Spielberg, De Palma, Milius, all those guys who became that new Hollywood, the reason they all found careers is because they were some of the first ever film school graduates at a time when there wasn't this whole tranche of film school graduates, that were a dime a dozen. They were the first, and they were this novelty where you're a producer, you go, oh, film school, huh? And then you get year after year after year after year. It's like, well, we have enough directors, we don't need any more. And then it just becomes this sort of like battle royale, this fight to the death to stand out. And it's that way with writing as well. Being the level of talent you need to work as a senior writer is way lower than the level of talent you need to break in as a junior writer. You don't need to just be as good as that guy who's writing the Marvel movie. You need to be like so much better than him that they're actually going to take a risk on using you and not the guy they know.
Sure. So a couple different directions that I want to go with this. And first of all, I would say, it's interesting that I'd never really heard that angle of Spielberg or Milius or, or whomever, George Lucas, for, them, with film school being a novelty. Because I had a conversation with, I don't know if you know Theon Ultima. We talked about film a lot on a podcast I did with him recently. And I guess I always bought into the narrative of, old Hollywood had been, this bloated corpse that was making these very expensive flops a lot of the times, not unlike we see today. And, that I guess maybe that's the mythology of these filmmakers becoming edgy or bringing something new to the table and being able to be successful because of that. So it's an interesting way of putting it. And I'd be curious to know what you think about how much that type of dynamic could translate to our current moment. Since between publishing, because I know a lot of people who are in self-publishing, a great writer I like on Substack named Lisa Kuznak. I read her book that was, phenomenal. But it's one of those things that and you talked about this a little yourself, like it sounds like publishers are looking for very specific things from very specific types of people and very specific types of things from those very specific types of people. And I wonder what that's going to look like in the future, because to me, I see a lot of flops in the world of film, video games. And again, it seems like publishing is a little bit more opaque. That having been said, between that or because I know you talked to Pedro Gonzalez about like the pulp era and how much you love that, and how at the time that was seen as kind of, the term pulp has, become just a part of the lexicon, but it used to be synonymous with low quality paper, like the pulp paper. So I'd be interested to see between the self-publishing or platforms like Substack, where you can kind of create your own following, or independent film. Do you think it has the potential to supplant what's happening right now, or is that just a unassaultable castle?
No, it's definitely not unassailable. I think there are only two possibilities that are going to occur. Either the incumbent players, the studios and the publishers, are going to adapt, and they're going to sort of people, I'm not one of these people, but a lot of people have this line about capital being so good at like consuming or subsuming the opposition into itself. Like, I think if there's some new exciting edgy thing, there is a world where capital can come along, incumbent players can come along and absorb it and go, oh, we're going to hire whoever, Dan Baltic, and he's going to be like, we're going to have like Dan Baltic for like Penguin Random House, like, is that going to happen? Personally, I don't think so, but that is one way that they could keep themselves alive. The other way is that they could just fail. I think that after, there's sort of this high likelihood of a company going under in the first 10 years of its existence, and after that it's like solidly 1 or 2% every year, but it doesn't go down. 100-year-old company is not less likely to die than a 15-year-old company. And much in the same way, these publishers could fall apart. Now, one thing they have going for them, and I think I talked about this a little with Pedro, that makes it somewhat unique is that they have their back catalogs, and their back catalogs are, I believe, 80+% of their revenues. And they don't like to talk about this because it would reveal how few copies their new releases sell. But there have been some cases, like in lawsuits and in discovery, where they've been forced to reveal this stuff, and you actually get to take a look, and you realize, oh no, they're making all their money selling, like, 1984, The Grapes of Wrath, and like the 50 books you've heard of, and that's most of their revenue. And that actually leads to this sort of bizarre zombie project where the contemporary fiction that they put out is really bad because they're not being forced to release things that are popular and sell copies. And I'm specifically talking about literary fiction, not commercial fiction. I mean, werewolf smut is its own thing. But when you talk about like highbrow literary fiction, these things lose money. They spend way more on the advances for these authors than they know they're going to get back. And all of that is being just supported by the engine of sales of these classics. And that means that the people who run these companies can publish things that are basically ideologically or aesthetically appealing to them in particular. And they've managed to create this sort of tote bag mafia in Brooklyn, where all their offices are. And that's the kind of literary fiction you get. And that's part of why there are so many people like on Substack screaming, like, why is this all so bad? Like, because they can see the results, but they don't see like the economic mechanics of it. They just know something's wrong.
Right. And it seems to be, because I sometimes joke that, like, basically the two types of books that I read are like, it's a history of, like, how the Mongol occupation of Russia would, later affect, like, Soviet relationships with, like, the Caucasus, or like, the Dragon King Part 6, right? Because I enjoy a lot of fantasy and stuff like that, and I see a lot of the same thing in the fantasy space of these authors that I see get name checked a lot, but in the press, or influential, like, I guess influencers and the like the YouTube, or or bloggers, but I'd never meet a person in the wild who talks about half of these people. And in the new year, I'm, as a slight teaser, I'm starting to try to get a little bit more into literature and culture than politics, because it's a little bit soul killing. And trying to read, people like yourself. You mentioned Dan Baltic, a lot of these like Substack native talents. And I'm going to be interested to see how that goes, because it seems like these people do have some sense of organic popularity and getting sales and reach that seems to be at least on par with some of these darlings that are maybe more, connected or ideologically aligned. So I'll be interested to see, because it feels like, these, I'm holding for the audience. I'm holding up my hands that these two lines are starting to intersect right now, and it'll be interesting to see if there can be some kind of supplanting there.
I wish. I certainly think that can happen, and it might happen. I will say, I think there's a little bit of a deceptive quality to the relative popularity of Substack native fiction, because the stuff that gets popular on Substack is the kind of stuff that other alt authors like, and alt authors like to write about what they like. So say you have a book that sells 100 or 200 copies, right? Selling 100 or 200 copies in TradPub is like the most abysmal failure you can imagine. But if you sell a couple hundred copies to Substackers, that's going to turn into a dozen, 2 dozen, like essays, notes. You sort of get this like buzz, even if it's not yet penetrating the public. So I wouldn't say it's at a par. I would say the highest echelon of alt lit is maybe touching the lowest echelon of trad pub. But like you think of something like Honor Levy, which is very much stylistically alt lit. However, her book, my first book, through sort of a fluke, ended up being published with trad pub through this bizarre circumstance. And I mean, you look at the amount of ratings she has on Goodreads and Amazon. This is obviously a book that's sold like way more copies than a comparatively popular true alt-lit book, despite like not really being loved by as many people. So, it is a little bit of a niche space still in that regard.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of my friends is an author, and he was originally working with a traditional publisher, and he ended up deciding to go self-publishing because they're like, all right, well, you need to have XYZ amount of followers, you need to have they already wanted you to have a pretty significant social media presence. So it does make me wonder if it's again a bit of a zombie thing, since like isn't that like the idea, like isn't that why traditionally you would go to a traditional publisher? Because at least I guess that was my logic. If you already have an organic audience, then you could probably just sell directly and have your own following.
Yeah, that's true. And then it becomes in part a financial and part an emotional decision for the author. But you can imagine a world where basically traditional publishing does not mint stars anymore,
Mm-hmm.
which is not the case. Currently, they do try to mint stars. That's one reason why they go after debuts so much. But they also go for proven self-published authors or independent authors. I say independent not to try and gas it up, but because the difference between like being published by a small press and being self-published is so semantic and inconsequential now that I really think that that indie presses and self-publishing are kind of all one thing, and consequently I just say independent publishing. But anyway, yeah. One is, do you stand to make more money? And there's a good chance, if I've sold 10,000 copies of, Werewolf Smut on Amazon, there's a good chance I could sell 50,000 more in Barnes & Noble. And I can't get there myself. Even if you can get on Amazon self-published, you're not, it's going to take TreadPub to get you into Barnes & Noble. They hold the keys still,
Mm-hmm.
even if they're taking a cut. And what, is it right for them to take a big cut when they didn't discover you? They didn't turn you into anything? Maybe they're just leeches, and then maybe some new company comes along and they go, hey, we're only going to work with popular indie authors. We're going to make the deal with bookstores to get them on the shelf, and we're going to take a third of the cut that TradPub takes because we know we're not doing the work. We're just basically like connecting vendors and successful authors, and then there goes TradPub, so they can't keep the margin for nothing forever. If they're not doing the work building up an author, they're not going to be able to keep that margin.
Yeah. Well, especially because it feels like a lot of these terms are increasingly kind of arbitrary, since I know an author like Brandon Sanderson is like the biggest name in fantasy. And I think he might technically be an independent publisher at this point. He does everything in-house and funds it himself or does it through Kickstarters. But that makes me think about something else that I wanted to talk to you about, especially vis-a-vis Brandon Sanderson and or the Werewolf Smut. What are your thoughts on like, highbrow versus lowbrow, where the line lies, or what you enjoy versus don't enjoy on that, since that seems to be a conversation that I'm seeing a lot right now. And I'm somebody who, I enjoy some lowbrow depending on how you look at it. I'm a big Conan the Barbarian fan. I love me some Robert E. Howard, and again, like that used to be considered very lowbrow, but rereading it now, I think like it's well written from a technical standpoint.
I don't think I've ever turned away from something because it was too lowbrow for me. The way I'm going to turn away from something is if I don't find it sufficiently interesting to my taste, either in terms of like the characterization or the, the plotting, or the level of complexity. Those are great examples you said. I mean, I just watched Showgirls. I showed that movie to one of my buddies the other day. That's one of my favorite movies. And I mean, that's an incredibly lowbrow story, right? On purpose. But it's executed with this very, very high level of craftsmanship that you can see in the lighting, in the directing, and even the choices that are ridiculous, like in the acting and the blocking, are deliberate, right? So I guess the short answer is I don't consider the higher lowbrow quality of something. I mean, to be clear, there is a certain fun in feeling like you're reading something hip, whether that's like a rediscovered classic or a book that just came out, sort of being a hipster in that way. But, if I'm not enjoying the experience of reading, I'm going to have a really hard time. I'm not going to read like an 800-page Romanian novel because it's got buzz if I'm 100 pages in and I'm not enjoying it. I'm not that kind of person.
Yeah. Something you said made me think of, so just like the quality that goes into a film that's made with passion. And I wonder, what do you think about the current state of filmmaking right now? Since, it was a Halloween, like what was that, a couple of weeks ago, and I was just watching, a couple Halloween movies with my wife. And even if we're just watching like corny, that 2001 Scooby-Doo movie or some corny Halloween movies, or I talked again. One of my favorite movies is the 1980 Conan the Barbarian movie that John Milius did. It feels like just the level of craftsmanship has gone down, at least in like mainstream Hollywood in recent years, just from a storytelling perspective, visually, like the blocking. I mean, it feels maybe most like one of the best examples I can think of. Recently, I did a podcast with somebody else, and we did the original Independence Day from 1997 or whatever it was, and the more recent one. And I was just struck by like how much lower the quality was, just in terms of, again, like the filmmaking from a technical standpoint, the writing. It just felt like a significantly lower quality film. And is that something you've noticed at all, or am I just
Yeah, no,
idealizing
films
things?
are really bad. No, by and
Okay.
large, they're really bad. And if one part of the movie is serviceably good, it's going to be outweighed by the fact that all the other departments, for the most part, are either misfiring or haven't been given a chance to succeed. Pretty much everybody making the big decisions in Hollywood at every level is not the correct person to be making those decisions, even down to like coordinators and secretaries. I wrote a pretty cynical short story about this called War and Peace, which you can find on Futurist Letters. That was very reflective of my experience working in a Hollywood agency, and not for the better. But yeah, you basically have venture capital and private equity who are trying to say, how can we make the same thing cheaper as much as possible? Just like, private equity asks, like they own Chipotle, and they ask like, what is the minimum amount of beef we can put in the burrito before people stop going, right? Which is not the way a chef thinks about Chipotle, but that's the way like private equity is going to think about it. You have basically a film school system that at best rewards compliance and sort of neuroticism in completing assignments, and at worst just sort of basically arbitrarily pulls people according to this sort of value matrix of social justice and whoever they consider to be the flavor that they want to fill out their roster at the moment. or is, in the case of USC, oftentimes just a legacy, aka Nepo admit. And then these people staff the companies, the film companies. They don't have a classical education. They don't read. People literally don't read. They're not reading like, Sidney Lumet, like making movies. They're not reading anything. If at most they're watching older movies, like someone had a quote where it was like, the people who to make Star Wars, George Lucas read like the entire Western canon and all these epics and Eastern myths. And these days, people who are contributing to Star Wars just watched Star Wars. It's regurgitated. So yeah, all of these are the thing. They're trying to cut costs. They don't have the craftsmanship. They're not coming out of theater. They're not studying the canon. They're not studying the history of Western art. They don't know the fundamentals. The cameras are creating ugly images. It's just on all fronts. It's pretty much getting worse. Pretty much every front, except maybe I think the craft services I've heard is pretty good. Like on a Marvel movie, but I wouldn't know.
Well, maybe someday. Well, it just kind of as a side tangent. Are you a Harlan Ellison fan?
I have not read any Harlan Ellison. No.
He's one of my favorite sci-fi authors, just based on his output. Since he's very funny, very darkly cynical. Like I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, his most famous work, I think.
Right. I think I might have read it in high school.
Yeah, but I just say that because there's this really funny story about essentially the same thing where he wrote a treatment for an Asimov book. I can't remember which one it was, and he spent all this time writing this script, and he brought it into this Hollywood producer, and he's like hounding him. He's like, "Can we have this meeting? I wrote it. Can we work on it?" And then he finally gets a meeting, and he starts asking him questions. Like, I don't think this motherfucker read it. So he's asking him questions about the screenplay. Is like, "Oh, do you like the part there?" You're like, "Oh yeah, totally." And he realized he didn't read it at all, and Harlan Ellison physically assaulted this executive, and he was forever banned from Hollywood because of that, which is part of the reason he's one of my favorite authors.
I believe it. That takes some integrity. And see, that's a really good capsule for this point, right? Because that's somebody who cares so much about the integrity of the artistic process that what happens, he gets blacklisted, right? So you are literally seeing the perverse filter occurring there, right? Where the compliant person, the person who would have gone along and bullshitted, is allowed to proceed, and the person who stands up for the art is banned.
It seems to be unfortunately common. But you mentioned one of the, and I'll let you tell the story, because when you were talking with Pedro Gonzalez, I guess as a framing device, because the larger question is about I'm curious to the degree to which trying to put forward a certain ideology or having a certain sensibility is true or overstated, because you were talking about how you were writing a fantasy story that was kind of more Middle Eastern or Egyptian in its world building and storytelling. And I guess they didn't think it was enough of that or something. I'll let you tell that story because it was fascinating. So I'm curious about that specifically, and more broadly how that plays into the conversation.
Interesting. I have touched on that sort of Near Eastern mythology enough times that I can't. There are a couple things it could be. I think that this was my novel Kalanisha Dreaming, which definitely did pull a little bit of Near Eastern stuff. And the weird thing with that was, basically in traditional publishing, you get people who put up this whole laundry list of tropes, mostly diverse tropes that they want in their submissions. But what you realize when you submit is that they have this extremely limited capacity or interest to read or entertain anything that's not really similar to what they already like. And so the subtext that, people like me maybe naively didn't realize at first is that they don't want what you would call diversity in terms of any meaningful departure from the project that they're engaged in artistically. They basically want new window dressing, right? It's like, we're going to put out a YA novel with a spunky girl fighting demons from every culture that has ever had demons on Earth, you know? Like, oh, what's the Korean word for demon? What color are they? What's their ability? Oh, look, a yaksha, you know, look, an African demon. Like, you know what I mean? Like, what we're doing in that way is we're basically doing like Children of Blood and Bone or whatever, blank and blank and blank, forever, running down the whole roster of world cultures. You know, that doesn't mean you actually want a story. You know, no one's going to want to run a story that like is actually shaped around like the Epic of Gilgamesh or like Gilgamesh. Like if you tried to submit a fantasy story to a traditional publisher or an agent with the protagonist of Gilgamesh depicted the way he is depicted in his epic, they would be like, at best they'd be like, I don't really relate to it, and at worst they'd be like, this is fucked up, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of another interesting discussion about how, because I posted something on Substack the other day about I'm not on TikTok. I'm not a TikTok hater. I'm just a 34-year-old boomer essentially. But I went to Book Talk and checked out Goodreads, and there's so much of, I don't know if it's performative or just people who are disconnected from reality, but they talk about whether or not a book is, or I guess even movie as well, because I've seen that in criticism in that same context of, I don't like this character, or I don't like what that character did, so the book is bad.
Like
which
morally
is
bad or like low quality?
They think what they did was morally bad. Like, you could say Tony Soprano is a morally bad character, so Sopranos is a bad TV show. And I see a lot of that, and I wonder how much of it is like infantilization or being performative, since especially like in the fantasy world, since up until basically anything in the pre-modern time, these people would be considered horrible monsters to us. Basically everything before like 1945, these people would be considered horrible monsters. But to me, like to read stories, especially from that are set in the pre-modern time, or things that are written, heaven forbid, before the 20th century, with character writers who have fundamentally different sensibilities, even from places all over the world. To me, that's what's great about literature or art in general. You can get these different perspectives, but it feels like I see a lot of this arrested development in that sense.
Yeah, and I think, funny enough, there's kind of a horseshoe effect with this, where you get people who are, I mean, the stereotypical images of a young progressive woman, but it's a lot of kind of different people in effect saying, oh, this is when you depict bad actions in your art, you're putting bad out into the world in this almost like spiritual, like talismanic way, like you're creating like a cursed artifact, and then you get this large swath of people who are like, no, you can depict this stuff with nuance, and like it's good, it's enriching, like you just have to be an adult. And then you actually get sort of I guess you'd call like a reactionary fringe, who are like, yes, when you depict like a based, racist and misogynist Chad, like in a book, like it does affect the culture. Like they agree about the talismanic power of the depiction. They just have inverse values where they think that it should be, put forward. So there is, I don't want to just go ahead and say like, oh, that's ridiculous. Like a very popular story about a bad guy could never encourage bad behavior. Like I do actually think the culture in some ways does get driven by the art that gets popular, but certainly it's not as simple as like oh, if we regulate art to only show people like hugging and holding hands, we'll get rid of violence. You know what I mean? Like these problems still exist in society, and ultimately people know when they're being condescended to. Adults,
yeah. Well, I think also it's probably also I think it caters to those middle class sensibilities as well. It makes me think of I don't know how much of a history buff you are, and forgive me if you're not. I think you might have mentioned that, but I was reading a book about the years leading up to the Russian Revolution,
Yeah.
and there was this movement amongst like the upper class Russian nobility and bourgeoisie about like, oh, we love the peasants, we want to see the peasants represented in literature, and like you can't have the peasants doing anything bad because they're this. They had like this very paternalistic, like, oh, they're just so good and kind, and they're unspoiled by modernity in the ways that we are. um, and we all know how that ended up turning out, as far as with the degree to which peasants are capable of violence, but also another funny anecdote from that same book of like these upper middle class or downwardly mobile nobles would go out into the countryside and teach the peasants to read, and like, oh, you need to read Marx, or you need to read these books about peasants, as being so noble, and they had virtually no interest in it, because I would imagine they would feel condescended in the same way that, like, I sometimes see that where in modern media, where there's like this very condescending way that quote unquote marginalized groups are treated. That's, if you've heard like the magical Negro trope, but it's been um ad nauseum repeated amongst different groups. Like, I would take somebody like John Waters making queer art where people are like weird and off-putting but human over the Netflixification of all this any day.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the central tension, right? It's like they're aware of this tendency to sort of talk down from the bourgeois perspective, which is why people institute things like, hashtag own voices, where like, oh, we're going to go to the source. But the thing is, they can't actually handle, nor do they want to go to the source. So they're just caught in this paradox, right? Where they're trying to dredge up authentic voices, but they can't actually be authentic. They have to basically be mouthpieces for the existing sensibility. And so the people that they pluck to fill these roles are very like psychologically tortured or like aberrant people, because they're existing within this sort of like false. I saw someone on Substack yesterday calling it, what did they call it? Basically like auto exoticism, like they're, to look at
Sure.
yourself through this bourgeois lens in this recursive way, sort of doing a character, like, especially if you're second gen, if you're a second gen immigrant American author, you're going to get so much pressure, not just to write specifically about your immigrant experience, but to basically fabricate the stereotype of an immigrant experience. Maybe the place that everyone learns to do that is in college admissions essays, where you're basically supposed to create this very absurd caricature of your hardship, and this just gets drilled into people who are writing in publishing today.
Yeah, I've noticed that it's the fetishization of like the American immigrant experience, instead is, I think, an experience that's fairly ubiquitous, across multiple generations. But now, we have, it felt for a couple years ago, it's like, the endless, second or third generation Asian American woman. Which, and here's the thing though, I'm not a reactionary. I'm like categorically against this. I want to see more diverse voices, but it feels like I don't want to circle this drain too much, because this moment of cultural I guess stuckness, whatever you want to call it, it's been discussed ad nauseum, especially because it feels like we're kind of past it. So I'm
We're
more
a couple of years
interested.
into what they call the vibe shift now.
Yeah, well, that's something I've always thought, like, that the vibe shift is something that's going to continue to be ongoing, probably until the mid 2030s, if I had to guess.
Yeah.
Um, so what do you think that's going to look like? Because I was particularly impressed with your piece locking in, since you don't, you've shown your face on Substack. You're definitely not a chud type of person, but I feel like you very much inhabited that headspace and used that terminology. And also, like, for somebody who is like, not familiar with it, that type of thing. Like if I showed that to my mom, I feel like she could figure it out through context clues. But I also really enjoyed how you were able to tell the story of like, it seems like, soft civil war or some sort of collapse just through like, you do the classic, in 2036, the government failed. My name is
Yeah.
John. Yeah. So, all that to say, partially to praise you for that, since I really enjoyed that, but
Thank
also
you.
like, how do you see, and I guess it's impossible to, call the shot while it's in the air, but what are some early warning signs do you see how things might turn out? Because I know you've done some work with Catherine D, who I also enjoy, and she's kind of rejected the fundamental presupposition of culture being stuck. It feels like it's in transit, and there's a lot of stuff under the surface, so to speak.
Yeah, I don't think that culture is stuck. I think there is an incumbent culture that is disinclined to voluntarily give way, but I think it sort of like a tectonic plate being pushed up from underneath. We're actively in the seismic shift. So is that stuck? Maybe it's stuck if you're only looking at the surface of the incumbent, but obviously there's all this stuff happening under the surface. As far as Locked In, yeah, and thank you. That was a short story I enjoyed writing. There were a few things I wanted to do with it. One of which was just to sort of make the reader think about the spectrum of violence. It's not like we all hit a switch one day that says civil war and then we're going to go boogaloo. Like things can become degrees of dysfunctional while still kind of hanging on. You look at something like Lebanon, which has been through different sort of waves of sectarian violence over decades. But yeah, it was funny. I forget who it was. It might have been Jack BC. I was talking to someone who's European about Locked In, and they said something like, yeah, you had this kind of preposterous premise for the story, which was like a civil war between Idaho and Oregon. And in my head, I was just thinking, oh, those are like some of the most likely states to go to war, if I'm
Yeah.
being for real. Like I lived up in the Willamette River Valley. Like you look at the people on the coast and the people inland in the Pacific Northwest, and it's like they're ready to fight. So
Mhm.
it to me it felt grounded, but
I thought so as well.
yeah. Where do I see things going is the question. Obviously I don't think culture is stuck either, although I think it makes sense why someone would say that. I think I mean, I don't know. I was wrong about the 24 election. I thought Kamala Harris was going to squeak through despite being an extremely unpopular candidate. And I was wrong. People were more forgiving of Donald Trump than I thought they were going to be, at least in Pennsylvania, at least by a couple points. So maybe I'm not the best person to predict the future, but I guess I'll still stick to my prediction that there's going to be a swing. But I want to say like, oh, there will be a swing back to the Democrats. Like so much of that depends on who they run, and the Democrats have shown over like what 15 years that they just have this like pathological inability to run anyone
Mhm.
interesting. So who knows? I mean, in part, it's going to be like whoever the chair of the DNC decides to shill. I don't know how the future is going to go, but I don't think it's going to be like red wave forever.
No. Well, yeah, I do think there's definitely something to be said for the Democrats' uncanny ability to, snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
Truly.
Many such cases, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your disposition. But I guess that's interesting. Like I have, from me as well. Like I mean, I don't know if Vance has the juice. But other than that, like who do the Democrats have? Who's
Yeah, I mean, I
popular
think Vance
nationally?
is better positioned than anyone on the Democratic roster right now. Then again,
Yeah.
Obama came kind of out of nowhere, so they could pull that again. I just don't know who it would be
I suppose we'll see. I mean, I guess I was talking more culturally, but
culturally.
culture is downstream of politics as well. Since, um, I guess we'll see. Like, depending on how things go economically as well, because I think there's a historically in the United States and more broadly, there's a convergence of becoming more conservative as material conditions decline and or there's war. A term that I've tried to coin is like hillbilly elegy core, of like, or, MAGA exploitation, where um, I don't think it's ever going to be mainstream, but there does seem to be a lot of at least surface level signaling towards that cultural cohort. I don't know how much depth there's going to be, or if there is going to be, if something reactionary like that is even capable of creating something that's great and universal. Since we'll use Star Wars, since you mentioned it, how Lucas read the entire Western canon. He read Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, and he tried to synthesize all these old like Buck Rogers and stuff like
Yeah.
that, samurai films, the mythologized version of World War II. And I think that's why, Star Wars is a part of like modern American culture and national mythology, why you can still, basically make the same damn movie over and over again and people will still watch it. I don't know if something more reactionary, either, on the more leftist reactionary or right wing reactionary bent, can create something like that again. So I don't know. Do you think we could ever have like a mass popular culture again, or is it going to be much more sectarian in the future?
I think that you definitely will get a reactionary, and a lot of people would say we already do, depending on how leftist they are. Wave. It's really not hard to make a reactionary piece of art. You basically just need to show like the normal, the healthy, the lawful, the petit bourgeois, the traditional as being like good. I mean, you could say like pretty much every Hallmark Christmas movie is a reactionary movie, and that doesn't mean it's like on a MAGA soapbox, right? It's
Well, I was
just
going to say,
basically like creating this
Sorry,
worship of like the normal and the traditional, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even something as simple as like, oh, like this Pixar movie, like the main character's dad is like a cop, or like Zootopia. Like Zootopia actually is a bad example because that movie is incredibly schizo in its political analogies in both
I've never
directions.
seen it.
I would be fascinated to hear your analysis of what the hell Zootopia is trying to say.
I'll tell you what, I'll watch Zootopia and we'll talk again, and we'll talk
Please do.
the furry
because it's
reactionary
obviously got a lot of opinions about race and policing and mass culture, and I have no idea what they are.
Yeah, here's the thing. I'm a 34-year-old man without children, so I don't really keep up with
just go find a child somewhere. Say,
well,
hey kid, you want to watch Zootopia for me?
Yeah,
well,
what could go wrong? Well, I have a nephew now. I had a nephew just born, so I feel like I'm very solidly in a cool / weird uncle territory. But in any case, it'll be because it kind of makes me think of like, you see that it's kind of a hate watch thing I do sometimes, of like, middle-aged men without children getting really mad about, Disney Pixar movies and whatnot. But that having been said, I do feel like there could be like, because I was going to say like Christopher Nolan's Batman movies feel like very reactionary to me, but they're still good. Maybe, for better or for worse, I'm not solidly at one camp or another. And I feel like a lot of good action movies are just kind of inherently reactionary. And I still think maybe I'm, like insanely optimistic that I think like American culture still can catalyze and have another mass popular culture or mass consciousness. And we went through a similar dynamic in like, the 1800s, like, the late 19th century, and we were able to recatalyze. Hopefully we can do it without another war, because it does kind of feel like we're culturally in an interwar period, since, there was so much great art in like, Berlin, between the two world wars, but, you want to avoid that level of destruction. You want to, if at all possible, this is, again, perhaps a hot take, but the Xanadu Review official stance anti-war. We don't want wars.
Anti-war, no boogaloo. Yeah, I think we have a long way to go. I think we have a long way to go if we do go down that path. So I'm optimistic that the grillers will win, and we can continue to grill
Yeah,
for decades.
the American urge to grill, the will to grill, if you will, is
The will to grill.
that's going to be my manifesto. Look out!
That's
for
right.
it.
Yeah, forget the will to power. We do need the will to grill.
I mean, there is something to be said for that. There is, like, Lee Kuan Yew, but for grilling, basically. We'll see how that goes.
I mean, come on, if Lee Kuan Yew was running any part of America, he'd be grilling up a storm. He'd be out there with his apron and
he would. Many
barbecue.
have said what America needs is its own Lee Kuan Yew, or at least I've said that. And I know you've discussed Lee Kuan Yew
we did a whole
recently.
multi-part thing on the Futurist Letter Show. So, hey, any PJ fans, if you want to hear us talk a lot about Lee Kuan Yew, we read his whole biography and we did 2 episodes on him. So go check out the Futurist Letter Show.
It's good stuff. I can't recommend it enough. So I have one more short topic I wanted to get to with before we started to wrap up. So you've talked about how you're a bit of a gamer. I'm not too much of a gamer myself. Only in like the last year have I started playing video games more than I played Pokemon as a kid and Skyrim. I'm just not much of a gamer. My wife is, but I've heard you talk about them a couple of different podcasts. So I'm curious, do you think video games can be art? And what do you think qualifies there? Since I'm honestly kind of excited to anytime I talk to people who are gamers, I'm a 34-year-old man and I've played 6 video games in my life. Do you have any recommendations ever? And just if you invite a Jehovah's Witness into your home, they're just oh my God, somebody is actually going to talk to me about this. So what are your thoughts? Can video games be art, and what would you recommend if so?
Yeah, sure. Video games can be art. I think every video game contains art. I think that the question of whether the whole video game itself is art is a question of how much you are being taken through this sort of singular auteur motion, how much there's one creative passion that has driven the experience that you're having. Because it gets a little, sure, something like Disco Elysium. And that's a game I recommend. That's obviously art. It's a beautiful game. It was adapted from a book. You go through it, you make decisions. I mean, it's very literary. It's a great game. Something like Fortnite. Are you is Fortnite art? There is art in Fortnite. People design the environment and they paint it and they, but it's almost sort of like a miniature in which you have these emergent stories, oh, I had this crazy experience where I, shot this guy and then I was hiding in a bush, and that's an experience that makes you feel like art, but it wasn't crafted for you by someone in the specific, Then if you keep going down the line, it's okay, well, is a tennis court art? It's a crafted aesthetic environment in which you have an experience. Is Yellowstone National Park art? The way they put up, there's a spectrum. But I would say there are artistic components to every video game, and the more narrative and the more crafted the narrative is, the stronger your case that it is a piece of art. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially because, at least my understanding of film, there is the technical, the actual artistic side of writing the story, the art of the acting, and then it will break down into set design. It's technical work, but there's an artistry to it. Especially again, if you watch older films, I just remember watching some '90s TV show with my wife. It'd be fun to work set design to make these props, or even in the case of computer animation, there is a technical coding side to it. There's also a lot of design elements to it as well.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's art. You can have a work of art as a singular, but you can also have art as this sort of uncountable noun. and like in that sense, yeah, obviously they are art, or at least they have art as a major component of them. As far as what other games to play, I mean, I'm obviously going to be biased toward my own favorites, a lot of them being nostalgic. I don't know what sort of experience you're looking for, whether it's like console or PC or strategy or narrative. Like what do you find yourself drawn to?
I definitely like a narrative heavy game since way back in the day I played like Knights of the Old Republic, and I got that again and I'm playing that and I really enjoy something that
Oh,
has
nice.
kind of like you said a really crafted there's a story to it as well as the mechanics in the story will interact with each other very well, if that makes sense. Since I was thinking about, because I don't know if this is your type of thing as well, but I would play Dungeons and Dragons with my friend, and I would I was the DM for Dungeon Master for those at home who are not familiar with. I'll come up with the story as well as the mechanics of it and everything, design everything, and it made me really appreciate not just storytelling from like a different side of the technical level. Since I write primarily nonfiction, although I plan to change that, but appreciating the technical side of the beats of a story as well as how it will intersect with the mechanics of the game. And that's something like I really appreciated about Knights of the Old Republic. Again, like it feels like a huge world, but there's really only like 3 places that you can go. And I think be it a video game or a movie or a book, I feel like that's really the craft of making it feel bigger than it actually is.
Well, I guess, if you're really starting at the beginning, I'll say this. Mass Effect was incredibly formative for me. That's by BioWare, the same developer. You can get the Legendary Edition, which is a remaster of the whole trilogy. I don't know if you have like a console in your living room. You
Yeah,
can
a
play it
bunch.
from the
My wife's a big gamer. She owns
She's got it. Okay.
BioShock. Yeah,
Well, I
so
don't know if she has ever played Mass Effect?
yeah, she loves that one. She's been trying to
All
get me
right.
to
Well,
play that
maybe
one
she would
too.
have
So
fun watching you do your own playthrough.
she's been asking for that one.
I think you should do it. I think you should create a shepherd. You should do the trilogy. She can watch over your shoulder, see the choices you make. I think it'll be a fun time. If you like KOTOR, you'll like Mass Effect.
Yeah, that's what people have told me. That kind of makes me think of one more thing because this is maybe a big question, and we'll maybe just touch on it depending on how much time you have. But I was having a discussion with somebody else about the potential to utilize AI for art, and not just say, "Hey, Siri or whomever, make me a picture." The example I thought of was, say, there is a team who is like, there's a writer and artist, and the writer will create the story, and the artist will design all the characters, and they do all the character design, the set design, and they will use AI essentially to do the grunt work of animation, or like a video game or something like that. And I'm going to be really interested to see how AI is going to be able to be utilized in the future for art, specifically more so for visual medium, since I think there's interesting potential there, just as far as offloading some of the grunt work. Since I use the example of animation because that's essentially how it works right now. You'll have an artist who will design the characters, and there'll be a director who says they have to do XYZ, and the animators will do, I don't want to say the grunt work, but the technical coding side of getting the Zootopia bunny to I don't know, burn down a police station. I haven't seen that movie. I don't know what happens in it. I assume she burns down a police station at some point.
No, quite the opposite.
Oh, well,
she's
don't
on the
ruin it
court.
for me. Don't ruin it for me. Like I said, I'm going to watch it and I'll get back to you. But do you see any potential there? Because there does seem to be a knee-jerk reaction against it, which I think, interestingly enough, you see it most strongly at the cultural lefties. That having been said, I think there is potential for AI to use to find new and creative ways to use it. Since the parallel that I see, if maybe this is overly idealistic, is back in like in the late 60s, early 70s, the synthesizer keyboard was first invented. And in France, they tried to ban it because like this is going to take jobs away from musicians. Nobody was going to obviously with the benefit of hindsight, nobody was going to hear a synthesizer symphony. But you were able to have bands like Kraftwerk or all these new wave bands that were able to use it in interesting ways. And I think like, auto tune, like of course you can get your Will.i.ams and your Fergies and whatnot, but I think they're your Daft Punks and your Kanye Wests who use it, a technology in a very interesting way. So all that to say, like, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Am I being too idealistic, or is it just like, it's going to depend on the application, or is AI just the death of creativity in that sense?
No, there's no death of creativity for two reasons. One, people want to be creative, even outside of economic incentives. They just enjoy it. Two, consumers enjoy seeing the blood, sweat, and tears of a human being. The mythology, think about how much people actually do it in a kind of sick way. But you think about The Dark Knight, the movie. We were just talking about that. Brilliant movie. So much of the experience of watching the Heath Ledger Joker performance is tied up in the sort of whisper of like, oh, that drove him crazy and he died, which like a lot of people say that that's like an urban legend and it wasn't related to the Joker role. Then other people say it was the Joker role. I don't know what the truth is. But the point is,
I prefer to think it is.
You would never have that sort of chill run down your spine watching him do those deliveries if he hadn't been driven to death by it. Even if it was the exact same performance, if it was computer generated, you just wouldn't feel that way. There is something to seeing the human choices go into the art. And so, yes, there will absolutely be AI. There already is AI integrated into films that people like. I mean, Furiosa, they were face morphing her as they switched actors, up into Anya Taylor-Joy from the younger actress. They're combining them. George Miller was like, yeah, that's a creative choice I'm doing. And like, people loved Fury Road, and a lot of people loved Furiosa. And there are a lot of people, as you said, largely leftists, and they're largely motivated by labor anxiety, who are going, oh, George,
so.
You're washed, you're dead to me. And it's like, that's still the same guy, that's still the same George Miller artist that he was before, even if he's now doing something that means he's dead to you. And there will be new generations of people. You look at, here's a great example, something like Royal Road, which is basically a site where teenagers serialize their fiction, like isekai and like portal fantasy, like Eastern influenced Western fiction. And it is completely natural for them to use AI cover art. It's not a lot of controversy. Compare that to something like r/self-publish, which is mostly millennials, where it's you're literally you're dead on a stake if you talk about using AI for cover art, right? And just the difference is like how AI native those respective generations are, and how much they feel like alienated. So it is going to be generational. I think the millennials will probably go to their grave hating AI. They probably are too late to change, but then you're going to get people after that, and it's a spectrum. What I like to give two examples. On one hand, if you say paint me a sunset, you type that into ChatGPT. If you do that right now, ChatGPT will paint you a sunset. It's ludicrous to say that you made that. I mean, you generated it, but like you didn't paint that in any conventional sense. At the same time, you can be an artist, literally, with a palette of like oil paints and painting a sunset that you see before you, or from your memory. And you could ask ChatGPT, hey, what ratio should I mix these colors on my palette to get the top of the horizon? And now, like intellectually, there's AI like in your painting, in your physical painting. Like you ask ChatGPT what color to use, but that doesn't, like, it's still your painting. No one's going to argue that. And so we have to decide like where on this line in between those two extremes, like we lose the humanity, and that's going to be something we figure out democratically as a culture.
Yeah. Well, also because I think there's the just generated stuff is tends to be, by its very nature, it's just going to be kind of middle of the road. But I'm interested to see how it's going to evolve. Not even just like the raw computing capabilities, but the application. Um,
Yeah.
because I guess maybe I'm a millennial and I'm kind of AI agnostic. I use it for work all the time because I work in like the tech world and it's super, super useful. Um, but it to kind of loop back to something we were talking about at the beginning, it almost makes me think of again the pulp genre of, back in the day it was considered absolute lowbrow, like the worst thing you could possibly do, like, somebody like, Robert E. Howard or Lovecraft. Some of these people are, just absolute jokes. The idea that they could show their face as serious literary authors, beyond the pale. But now, these days that has a certain aesthetic, a certain style.
Yeah.
It's its own sort of literary scene. I wonder, like, maybe it'll be Gen Z or Gen Alpha who grew up native with it, like you said, that'll find a way to do something that's completely new and creative. So
I'm
that'll be
sure they will.
interesting.
I'm sure they already are. I'm sure people 10, 15 years younger than me are crafting things that are, you know, I like to say, in 100 years, there will be murals on buildings of people who worked in mediums that to us now are jokes.
Mhm.
But it's not impossible to imagine a TikTok star, a VR star, a YouTuber on a mural with complete sincerity in a
Mhm.
century when those mediums are old enough that they've been sort of venerated, and
Yeah.
added to the canon of Western art.
Well, I don't think that's particularly abstract or controversial at all, considering, there's now statues of like rock musicians and, like, old soul musicians that was kind of
Yeah.
similarly lowbrow not that long ago. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There's a bronze statue of the Fawns there, and maybe that maybe that's a little too far, but I guess some people really love the Fawns.
Yeah. Anything I think gets that sheen of nostalgia and time just keeps rolling on.
Mhm. Well, Cairo, I think we're coming close to the end of our time here. I really appreciate you coming on. Do you have any plugs or promotions? Do you have anything coming up in the near future, or do you want to just once again talk about futurist letters or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So you can read Futurist Letters. You can submit to Futurist Letters. That is futuristletters.com. You can become a paying subscriber and read all the behind the scenes from all our different pieces, see our after show episodes. I also have a novel out called Current Affairs. That's my most recent novel. It's about a young man trying to make his name in New York. It's sort of a neo-modernist, romanticist thing set in the present day. It's gotten some good word of mouth. So if you look that up, you can get it on Amazon, either Kindle or paperback. You can also find all my other books on Amazon. I've got short story collections. My previous novel before this was called Scene Bucks, Scenebux, through New Ritual Press. And if you like a kind of more deranged Mr. Hyde-esque ride through the tech world, that one is short and punchy, and people seem to like it. So yeah, find me on Twitter, Cairo A. Smith, on Substack. Don't be a stranger.
Awesome. Well, Cairo, I have one more question for you that I always ask every guest to end with. So there's a lot of crazy doom and gloom in the world right now, but what's something that makes you feel hopeful for the future?
Hopeful for the future. Well, I
Something that
actually
would, if you don't have
something that
anything.
would.
If you don't have anything, I always add that
I think
caveat.
there's a lot to be hopeful about. I just went to the State of the City speech for my small town of 20,000 people. And they basically said, yeah, we've been running for 60 good years. We have honest, hardworking civil servants. We don't have a lot of political infighting. We're adding improvements to the streets. We're making the trash collection better. We're working with the sheriff. Everybody's happy. We're living our little lives. The schools are good. And they expect life to go on like that. And I just thought, wow, you go down from the national level, you go down from the federal screaming, international clamor, and you realize there are hundreds of thousands of little towns all over the world where it's not a fight every day, where people are just living their lives and incrementally making things better. And I think you got to be hopeful when you realize that. It's just life goes on in the best way.
Well, Cairo, that's a beautiful sentiment. And, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
All right, have a good one.